All right, welcome everyone. It's so great to be here and to see you all. I'm Emily Hammond. I'm a professor here at GW and also interim vice provost for faculty affairs for the university. But since environmental law is one of my deep loves, it really feels like this is where I belong today. So happy to be moderating this panel on new approaches to environmental and climate justice. And I want to say most of our time for our amazing panelists, but I did consider maybe 3 points just to frame the conversation a little bit. The first, of course, relates to federal law and policy, and I'm guessing all of us have a sense of the holistic shifts that are taking place at the federal level to deepen rather than change systemic injustices that have existed in this land since colonization. We also know that weakened or dismantled federal environmental protections do translate into disparate harm to people and communities who lack systemic privilege. The final point, though, is I think where we're going to spend most of our time today, and that's that justice movements are creative, they are resilient, they don't depend on the federal government for their power. So all is not at all lost, and there's a lot of work to do, and I'm excited to hear about how each of you are thinking about those topics right now. We'll go in order from, I guess it would be your right to left, if you're looking up here, starting with Danielle Stokes, professor of law at the University of Richmond School of Law, and I'd be glad to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you all. And as I mentioned in my prior comment, it feels like such a good fortune to have followed Professor Lee's remarks this afternoon. And so I wanted to just ground my portion of the conversation with saying what a privilege it is to be at an institution where I get to teach environmental justice, where there is no sort of censorship, where there is no request that I rebrand or remodel what I'm teaching. That's not to say that I haven't thought about doing that to sort of get a more captive audience, but I acknowledge the fact that that in itself is a privilege to be able to teach people about these concepts at a time when, as we've just heard and have been hearing, there are so many things that are under fire. So I don't take that lightly. And beyond that, I would say some of the themes that have come up throughout the day is sort of what is our responsibility as scholars? And I think there are lots of different models of scholars. And so for me, seeing my work as sort of a part of my broader life's goals, I try to think about the ways in which I get to incorporate the things I think about into the ways I show up as a community member, the ways I teach students, so that we can have more deep engagement and understanding of some of the issues that we continue to discuss. It also made me think about, well, what happens if there are 4 years of students who don't get to think about environmental justice? What does that mean about the future? The ways in which we use certain arguments, the themes that are sort of described in our sort of legal practice. What happens if we don't think about these issues when drafting contracts, when sitting around in boardrooms? And so for me, I feel I have a responsibility to not only research these issues, but to articulate them in a way that is digestible to students, to community members, and lots of folks sort of simultaneously. So what does that mean, or what does that look like? Well, my primary audience as a professor is sort of the legal academy, and being responsible and having the ability to articulate my ideas in a way that sort of receives the substance and validation of that group. But then how do I distill that down to be able to have those same conversations across different constituencies? And so that's where I spend a lot of time also thinking about, how do I make these issues resonate across scales? Because we've talked about the various sort of scalar challenges with environmental justice. And so that to me is, how do I serve as maybe an interpreter, an intermediary to articulate these issues across different constituencies? So what does that look like for me? I was a little taken aback because the topic is, I think, new approaches. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that I'm saying something new. I think I'm taking a different approach. I'm using different language. I'm articulating ideas in a different way. but not necessarily new, because I would be remiss to not acknowledge folks like Professor Lee, or Sheila Foster, or Cliff Villa, or Audrey McFarland, or Alice Caswan, or all these people who have spent their time investing in a scholarly body so that I could come along and sort of offer a new approach. So I'm not even going to pretend that it's out of the blue. What I will say is that, their research and their ability to articulate things about locally undesirable land uses, or LULUs, or not in my backyard, really has shaped my perspective, because I think about these issues most often from a land use perspective. That's where my practice background lies, and that's where I see a lot of opportunity for things like shifting decision-making that we've talked so much about. And so for me, it's how do I articulate decision-making processes that allow for these holistic approaches, to think about things like procedural justice, distributive justice, geographic equity, and all of these terms. How do we make that reality? Or how do I explain to someone, when I say procedural justice, I'm inquiring whether you understood that you could show up to a meeting, that when a notice went out, that you were able to participate. And so to do that sort of at the scale of the academy, I think I talk about this in terms of sustainability, and sustainability from the perspective of land use planning. And so with the sort of 3E framework of what's the environmental impact, the social equity impact, and the economic impact of decisions that we make. And also thinking about sustainability sort of along a temporal scale. What role does the past play for the present, and how we think about shaping the future? So I'm often sort of talking with students about this and thinking about it myself, like, where am I on the time horizon, and which piece of that puzzle matters most with the decision that I'm trying to make? And so the use of cumulative impacts for me has been very helpful in trying to think about that time horizon. So what does it mean to think about how the existing landscape, how the past has shaped that, what the future looks like, and then how do I consider that when making a future decision? And so when doing that, I've tried to explore this in a variety of ways. So through one concept that I've termed sustainable collaborative governance, but what does that really mean? Is that just a term? What have you? So it tries to suggest that if we look at sustainability as this tripartite feature of decision making, and do so so that's the sort of sustainable part. And if we do so in a way that incorporates collaborative justice. Now, what's that? Well, for me, that is infusing both formal and informal governance structures. What do I mean by that? Formal governance structures, city and local governments, state governments, the federal government, but also that interrelationship with business, with industry, with community, with NGOs. How do we formalize a system where the burden is not necessarily on the informal structure to engage with the formal, but that the formal structure has a responsibility to also engage with each of those constituencies in its decision-making processes. So shifting the burden or the onus from community or NGO or activists or whatever pocket, because industry often knows how to engage with the formal structures, business often knows, but how do we sort of support the additional parties in doing that? So one of the things that I've worked on recently was this project from redlining to greenlining, because I'm interested in history, because I'm interested in the past, how it impacts the present and shapes the future. And so when I wrote that, we were in a very different political climate. We had the funding from the Infrastructure Act. It was clear that there was a lot of money. So my thought was, how do we help to make decisions about where money should go and how quickly it can get there? And so really leaning into the role through that process of having local governments make decisions about the places of greatest impact. That's climate related, that's housing related, that's taking this whole holistic approach to how do we think about the interventions that are necessary to make places more resilient to climate change. And that often comes off as an urban sort of issue, or how that sounds like you're talking about an exclusively urban problem. And what I would suggest is that most often there's a lot more data in urban areas to sort of map onto the climate problem. But that's not to suggest that these types of processes or governance regimes would not be beneficial in other places as well. So we've talked a lot about, the role that states are playing at this current moment and some new approaches. So you heard from Uma Auka earlier today. So we've been exploring some new legislative approaches to how to integrate environmental and energy justice, and seeing the work that states are doing to try to formalize energy justice into their sort of siting governance for renewable energy. So there are lots of approaches, and I think a lot of creativity that is going on. Don't know if it'll be preempted, don't know sort of the teeth it will have, but would just say that there's a lot of movement at this moment, and that even if the things that I'm proposing might not be feasible at the scale that I sort of initially conceived of them, really just pushing for us to reimagine the way that we think about governance, the way we think about environmental justice, and learning to articulate procedural justice and distributive justice through real world experience so that people understand what those terms mean. So I will stop there, and am looking forward to the conversation with my fellow panelists. And thanks again for everyone who has put this event together.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And I invite everybody, if you have questions coming up for you as each of our speakers shares their remarks, please just make a note of them. We'll go through and hear from everyone, and then hopefully have a really interesting discussion. So next, I'm delighted to turn it over to Sara Colangelo, who is a professor and director of the Environmental and Law and Justice Clinic at Georgetown.
Great. There we go. Hi, everyone. It is so great to be here. I'm grateful for the opportunity and the invitation, and just happy to be in community and conversation with you all today at this moment. I, very much like Professor Stokes, I was intrigued by the title of this panel, especially at a time when I'm actively thinking and researching about ways to what I call reimagine environmental law and governance. So we're thinking along the same the same framework here. And I also considered this concept of new approaches quite creatively. I have this sense that when we talk about these enormously important issues of environmental and climate justice, it can be really tempting to default to big answers to solve these big problems, new statutes, new policies or frameworks to get at these systemic and deeply rooted predicates of injustice. And those transformative strategies definitely matter, and they have a very important place in the conversation. But today I want to offer two more narrow and maybe a little bit unusual approaches to environmental justice, one rooted in my clinic work, which I'll spend most of my time talking about, and one just sort of a teaser to some scholarship that I'm working on. The first is defending environmental information and community data as justice infrastructure. And the other is suggesting that something novel doesn't always need to be something new. It can mean old tools rooted in clear authorities that can become creative strategies to meet a new administrative law world that has become so increasingly hostile to environmental protection. So as I mentioned, the first is treating environmental information as the infrastructure of justice and defending it accordingly. Environmental justice rises and falls on a deceptively simple proposition that people have to know what's happening to them, have to know what's happening around them in the air they breathe, the water they drink, the conditions shaping their health before they can organize, advocate, or influence. And right now, I'd suggest that we're living in a moment of crisis when it comes to environmental information. So we could just start with access. So in early 2025, I don't need to tell this crowd, but EPA removed EJ Screen, the agency's environmental justice mapping and screening tool, from its website. It's since been stood up by other folks trying to preserve this data, but that triggered a cascade of downstream impacts on other federal and state tools that relied on EJ Screen layers and demographic indices. And the disappearance of EJ Screen was just one loss in this constellation of federal, environmental, health and equity tools, databases, and reports that were taken offline, fundamentally limiting the public's ability to identify hotspots, seek accountability, or validate lived experience. And it also influences what polluters know about their communities and what officials know about that pollution. At the same time, we've seen very significant grant revocations and funds terminated or otherwise jeopardized by the One Big Beautiful Bill rescissions of unobligated funds. Many of those were information generating projects. That is, they were projects whose core value was generating or operationalizing information. Things like air pollution monitoring grants, health impact assessments, pollution notification systems, funding for organizations that support citizen science, or increasing community capacity to participate in permitting and environmental decision-making, all of which are particularly vital in communities with cumulative burdens and where baseline monitoring is already very thin. So these initiatives could have formed or bolstered upstream infrastructure that makes pollution and its associated harms cognizable and actionable, whether that's for enforcement or stakeholder engagement, or just people understanding the ambient environment in which they work, live, worship, and play. Finally, I want to layer in what we're seeing happening at the state level to restrict community-derived data, known as community or citizen science, from collection, distribution, and use in a variety of ways. I'm lucky enough to work with a great client and my students on this issue, and we're seeing a growing number of states that are rewriting the rules of what counts as evidence or building statutory barriers that make community monitoring too risky, too expensive, or too irrelevant from a legal perspective to change outcomes. One that's received significant national attention is in Louisiana, the Community Air Monitoring Reliability Act of 2024 that targets the dissemination and use of community science. It mandates, for example, that any collection of community air data must be done with more expensive EPA-approved equipment and labs. It threatens severe penalties for using non-compliant data to allege violations against polluters. There's, of course, litigation challenging this law, but the suit and many experts and my own clients have talked to me about the law's deterrent effect on community warnings and advocacy. Even if this law is challenged successfully, we're seeing what I'm going to call a fast-moving legislative playbook. There are different approaches now being tried in different legislatures. The upshot is almost always the same, that it's barring courts or agencies from receiving this data and considering it unless it satisfies these very narrowly defined approved methods. I'll just mention a few, but there's more here, but I'm going to mention Kentucky, which has a 2025 bill that that similarly restricts monitoring data and how it can be considered. We have also seen Ohio's recent budget bill, which prohibits data produced from community air monitoring from being used as evidence and prohibits local air agencies from considering or relying on it for enforcement or monitoring purposes. And I'll say this, which is sort of an obvious point. Of course, we want our officials and our courts to be considering accurate data, but courts and agencies, you all know this, you're lawyers in the room, they have all sorts of ways to determine the reliability and accuracy in data and scientific assertions. That's called evidentiary gatekeeping. But these laws, they don't even let you near the door. And so that's a real problem. So we're seeing these portable approaches that I think will evolve as the lawsuits themselves resolve. In the meantime, they impose high burdens, cost, and legal risk that fracture collective action and chill community efforts to understand their environment, inform neighbors and family about ambient conditions. Now, much like Professor Stokes, I'm going to caveat this and say this is not a new problem. Affected communities have long had to fight for information. They have long experienced their voices and expertise being tokenized or erased. But I think this confluence of different examples merit our attention, especially as state-level enforcement, among other efforts, has become so vital at this particular moment. So if we're going to treat environmental information as justice infrastructure, then I would just suggest we need to start building redundancy and community control into these systems. That would involve legal and non-legal efforts. We need to try to protect public access to federal environmental information as a governance priority. When access disappears, of course, so does accountability. We also need to invest in community data and community monitoring. I think that means building durable data partnerships among universities, clinics, got to give a shout out to the clinics, local health departments, and community organizations. So the ability to document harm doesn't depend on one federal webpage or a political cycle. And then lawyers have a big role to play here. They need to resist and challenge the kinds of laws that I spoke about. And we need to support efforts on the flip side to protect residents' ability to collect, characterize, and use data about their lived conditions. And that could involve things that I'm not an expert in, like legislative lawyering or lobbying or drafting model legislation on some of these things. So I think there's a lot of roles to play. I know I'm looking down, my time, maybe I might even just leave it there, but maybe I'll just tease a little bit. I'll just say the second thing that I wanted to add, and maybe it'll come out a little bit more in Q&A, is again that I want to suggest that novel doesn't always mean something new, and maybe that framing will shake something loose for folks in this room. But some promising climate and environmental justice strategies, I think, can come from reactivating underused authorities already embedded in environmental laws. Part of why I started to play with that framing in particular is because of this burgeoning set of administrative law principles and interpretive methodologies that cut against new, progressive, and transformative ways of addressing environmental and climate injustice. You know them, you love them. The major questions doctrine, Loper Bright, they are going to influence how we can address these issues. And we have to think about not only the anti-regulatory gloss that those decisions create, but the anti-change gloss, as Professor Nina Mendelsohn has characterized it, that these decisions create. So we're struggling to create the change that we seek, especially in this moment of famously dysfunctional, congressional dysfunction in the environmental arena. So as the toolkit looks like it's shrinking a little bit, that's one thing I've been playing with. And I have one answer that I wrote about in my scholarship, but I will tease it there for Q&A. Thank you. And I won't be offended if no one asks about it.
Ask about it because I want to hear.
Oh, and may I just say, welcome to Karim Marshall, who is the Director of Climate and Energy Policy at the Consumer Federation of America.
Thank you, thank you. So I come to this from a weird place. I spent the bulk of my career as a local government enforcer, basically. Like I was a regulator. I wrote laws in DC. I wrote a good portion of our regulations for like 7 years. And then I ended up in the Biden administration implementing a lot of this stuff at the federal level. And I got to like sit down the hall from Charles Lee, like literally around the corner from me. So I think when we talk about these tools, when we talk about them at the federal and the state level, it's really important to have a very nuanced conversation about what's available to you. And also keep in mind the reality of what the landscape looks like. The landscape is not really like state versus federal. It is one configuration of states that is anti-regulatory, another configuration of states that is more environmentally protective, and frankly, a dysfunctional legislature at the federal level with a highly aggressive activist executive branch with a wholly permissive judicial branch. So what you're going to see over the next 2.5 years, hopefully just 2.5 years, you're going to see continuous instances where the 10th Amendment is now being tested on the inverse. Like previously, states' rights was the excuse that was used to do some really horrible things, And now it's going to be an opportunity for states to step in and say, no, we'd like to protect our citizens to a higher degree. So when you think about the landscape of the battle that we're facing, I want to just caution you about thinking about it as individual states. States have the ability to cooperate, and this is one of the things that I'm working in my day job. I am I'm essentially an advocate in my day job, but I also teach environmental justice at American and Howard. And the weirdest piece about teaching this as somebody who implemented it is that you have to be really deliberate about not being pessimistic, because the experience that you get from actually working in the field will be like, all right, well, this doesn't work. Like, my view on Title VI was very grim before I went into EPA. It's still relatively grim, but it is still a useful tool in certain circumstances. So being able to understand the landscape, understand the tools that are available to you, but also understand that they're situationally stronger. Like, if you're dealing with California, EPA may not, in this current administration, do anything with a Title VI complaint, but the conversation is a lot different if you are talking to California versus Louisiana. We will hold off on. It's really hard not to do like supplements for everything that's been said already, but I will say that the tools that Louisiana is using in order to try to eviscerate citizen science is a direct response to the settlements that EPA was able to put in place under Michael Regan. We weren't able to get a bunch of the stuff that should have worked, that should have been clear. We weren't able to get that implemented. But things like allowing the community to be able to do monitoring, this is a direct attack on that. We were able to provide the resources that were necessary for communities to be able to do this themselves. And then the next thing you see is a deliberate attempt to undercut that data. This is real data. These are valid monitors. They're properly calibrated when they're installed. We teach the people how to read them. So there shouldn't be a problem with this data. And again, judicial gatekeeping. There are mechanisms in place in order to make sure that the data is solid. Okay, so the other piece that I want to raise without being duplicative is when you think about environmental justice in the context of how we have to operate moving forward. Environmental justice has a bunch of different definitions. We're not going to get into the logistics of actually arguing over the words that are used to define environmental justice. But what you do know is that there is a disproportionate amount of access for one group and a lack of access for others. And EJ is about sort of leveling that out. And in some methods, it's about making sure that you compensate for the fact that other groups haven't been able to get as much access. When you think about what was in place, when you think about what's been funded, and some of that money is still trickling through the system, not all of it is gone, but the ability to close that gap, to understand that the federal grants process is labyrinthine and impenetrable and requires specialized education, but your community has a problem and the federal government has resources in order to address that problem, you need to know how to access those resources. Just basic questions, answering those basic questions. How do I set up a grants account? Those were some of the things that we put in place. Now, that's the baseline level, making sure that everybody has the opportunity to be able to participate in the process. That's the baseline. The next level is understanding that over the history of this country, we have never been as equitable as the promise affords us as a country. It's always, we're supposed to be here, we're trying to close that gap. The urgency with which we try to close that gap varies by administration. It varies by what's going on in the country overall. But understanding that investments like Justice 40 are meant to start as a primer. We are trying to set up a mechanism by which we have an opportunity to address historical issues and give these communities the ability not just to have the issues addressed, but to be able to identify and define them. So there's a lot of good resources that are still out there. All of these communities that apply for community change grant money, we had about $3 billion. The amount of requests we got in exceeded 27 billion. So the library of information that was generated by that exercise alone provides a map of problems and solutions throughout the country. We just have to find the will to provide the resources in order to address them. Of course, we're going to have to administratively update them. We'll have to update the prices that go along with everything. But the identification of the problem and the actual examining of potential solutions, that's work that's already been done. So we're in a good place to pick this work up in the future, provided that we have the opportunity to do so. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about, and this is a combination of like scholarship that I'm working on and stuff in my actual work life, is that states are becoming more aware of their ability to collaborate on standards. The ability to do a state compact is less of a gray area than it was previously, but there are opportunities for states to come together and say, we're gonna set this standard. Like we were really close a few years ago of having an interstate air compact for all the states from like Maine down to South Carolina, and it just fell apart. But these are things that I think states, particularly the ones that are trying to be more productive and more protective of their citizens, are starting to realize that these are possibilities. And we're seeing a lot of interest in being able to work across state lines and come up with standards that the federal government, again, because of congressional dysfunction, will probably never get to. And because of this administration's attitude towards regulation, probably won't come out in regs. So all this to say, we find ourselves in a really interesting time. I always try to start with and end with optimism in any of my remarks. It can be very overwhelming to look at everything that's happening. It's a lot, it's a tactic. So if you don't have the ability to work on everything, you of course don't. Pick one thing and work on that and try to focus on that. And if you see your colleagues, your compatriots working in other spaces, if you don't have the time to help them, at least provide emotional support, because this can be very draining work if you don't have that feedback loop. Thank you.
All right, I am so energized hearing all of your comments, and I'm guessing that was an impact out among everyone as well. I propose we shift to your questions. So yes, please.
Hi, so I have a question for Sara. I found your talk about data as a justice issue extremely compelling. And I wonder if there is an additional risk. It's not only that the government stepping out makes data disappear, but also whether the market is going to fill that gap and it's going to make data inaccessible. And what I had in mind is Watch Duty, the app that many people in LA use during the wildfires, right? It's using citizen data, and it's using official data, and it's creating a product that it's much better. And it was for free. Mm-hmm. But there is no guarantee that the next iteration of something like that will be for free. So do you have any examples of where the market has stepped in making justice even worse than the lack of data? That, that it has increased inequality in a sense. And just because I have to, right? What is the new but not novel tool that we've been choosing?
Thank you, Vanessa. It's so good to see you. Oh yeah, let me turn this. So in answer to your first question, I think that this vacuum, I'll call it, of data will certainly invite private players onto the scene. I think there are folks thinking about this quite seriously. One of the issues, one of the potential barriers, though, are these state laws that I mentioned. I think they're, depending on the iteration in a particular state, private corporations, people may be skittish about being the ones who are providing the mechanism to collect and generate and synthesize that data. So that's one potential barrier. So I think understanding how these state laws work, once they get going, the ones that survive legal challenges, I think that will be really important, and that will either hopefully end up inviting people in to the conversation, private solutions in. Your point is really well taken, and it's something that I haven't thought about at all yet, and makes me think that I need to be having this conversation with my students and my clients too about ensuring that where there are private parties stepping in to provide these data, that people have equitable access to things like the app that you mentioned. But in answer to your question, I'm not aware of anything right now where we're seeing large inequities, but it doesn't mean that with that vacuum, people won't try to monetize that. So it's a really good point and well taken. So the other thing that I'm working on right now is is thinking through how what I call affirmative emergency powers, which are baked into our federal environmental statutes and most of our state analog statutes, can be used to address imminent and substantial endangerments. Rob has written about this in the context of PFAS, so trying to find solutions for PFAS recently. But what I like about that is it's also a creative lens. So emergency powers are like bad words when it comes to in the environmental context. We think about emergency powers tend to be these exceptions or ways to circumvent environmental processes and protection. So I'm interested in thinking through flipping that script and sort of elevating these rarely used, very rarely used provisions in the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and Safe Drinking Water Act in particular. We're actually really good at using them in RCRA and CERCLA, but they exist in these other statutes, and we just really don't use them. And they're very powerful, and they're very powerful in this moment in particular, because unlike conventional enforcement, and I myself started my career in the environmental enforcement section of DOJ, so I'm very familiar with conventional enforcement, but that's tied to permit limits. It's tied to regulated pollutants. And we have a lot of problems right now when we think about environmental, particularly the environmental and climate justice space, that falls outside. I call it like living outside or living within the regulatory gaps. And so we need some tools that hit unpermitted pollution, that can address cumulative burdens of pollution. So those are some things that I'm playing with right now.
Can I just make a
No, I was gonna add a point about data, but you.
So similarly, and I guess from my perspective, so I haven't read the Louisiana statute, but the process that I think about, like, we don't trust Louisiana to sort of monitor air holistically. So that's the tension. So it would be possibly acceptable for Louisiana to say, okay, we want to streamline and have an efficient process by which we gather air quality data. But that then requires Louisiana legislators or regulators to impose that or to distribute those air quality monitors equitably, or to take a more sort of holistic approach to deploying like thinking about the location where those monitors are located. And so I think that's the part of the process that gets me excited or interested. Like, what do we do to inform the regulators? So if we're gonna have to live in this regime, how do we sort of educate them in a way such that those monitors are deployed in the places that are most susceptible to harm? And so it's, to me, also thinking about how do I work strategically within the governance regime that I'm in? Is it most effective for me to fight the law and say no community data? Or is it now in that sort of landscape effective for me to go before those decision makers to say, okay, we're deferring to you. You've taken this on. Now, how are you planning to distribute those monitors? Where are you choosing to place those? And so I think there are various points of intervention where environmental justice can still be at the forefront, and sort of working on that relational sort of aspect as between those formal and informal governance structures, so that we can hold the sort of government accountable for the things that they're responsible for protecting us from.
I'm laughing because I promise you I'm a liberal. But I'm gonna say something that's gonna sound like more like a revolutionary as opposed to a liberal, and I promise you I'm center of the road. The thing is this: Louisiana's not acting in good faith, right? Like there's some states that we know we just can't trust them. They have already made a decision that this community is a sacrifice zone. They, at best, will help relocate them, at best. But anything, they've already decided that the refineries and the oil infrastructure in there is far more important to the state than the lives of the people who are being killed by it. And I don't like readily jump to that, well, you can't trust the state line. It's really not my normal positioning. But in this case in Louisiana, it is clear that the state has made their decision and they are willing to sacrifice those people in that space. I wanted to But I did want to also add this thing about data and that we are in a really cool spot right now. There's no less than 7 different efforts to replicate EJ Screen. 3 of them are good. I mean, the thing is, you also got to understand, when they took down EJ Screen, they took it down with no notice. They took it down actually the day before I was scheduled to teach my students how to use EJ Screen. So I did my test on Sunday. I came in on Monday to teach. I opened it up and it wouldn't open. So we had to find one of the mirrors. And the mirrors went up really fast. Like the mirror that I used last year, it went up in like a week. So you've got a mirror for EJ Screen. You've got a mirror for CGIST. All the J40 data has been captured and replicated. So the data's out there. The commercialization issue that you are talking about, it's really difficult to understand a financial use case for this, which would corrupt it. But as of right now, no one's figured it out. But the minute somebody figures out how to make money off it, then we have a problem. But for right now, it's just information that's used by communities that need it. So.
Alex and then. All right, thank you for a great panel. So as an energy law scholar, it's unusual for me to get to 2 o'clock at a conference and the issue of data centers and AI has not come up yet. So I'm going to bring it up because it seems very relevant to this panel and might actually provide some new directions, right? So it's very hyper-local, right? As data, and I'm not taking a position that data centers are either good or bad or that AI is good or bad. Data centers come into a community or want to come into a community, and it's very local and state to some extent as to who the regulatory authority is. There's a huge demand by the community for information and data about them in order to respond to the water issues, the environmental justice issues, the climate issues associated with those. So, and it's happening all over the country at the same time, as opposed to just particular pockets of historically disadvantaged or underserved communities. So does that provide an opportunity to think about new approaches, use of AI in order to help generate data and responses to data, new ways for local communities to engage? So can you see it as a positive for the things that all of you, think about and are trying to develop in terms of processes and engagement and responses?
I have lots of thoughts about data centers. And I guess to your question in particular, I'm always thinking about trade-offs. And so, this is an issue that's acutely felt in Virginia, in Northern Virginia. That's not necessarily an underserved community or a sacrifice zone. But I also wouldn't necessarily subscribe to the notion that that's the community that should bear the burden of all data centers. So it's like I think about this along different pockets. Like there is an advantage to having access to information that is to an extent free or freely accessible and in a sort of quick way that allows people to make informed decisions because they have access to information. But I would also say, or the thing that comes to mind for me is educating local decision makers about what their choices mean. So what does this mean for energy consumption? What does this mean for environmental issues? And so how do we educate those folks to think about this holistically so that with each decision, it's not always the same benefit or burden in the same place? And so I don't know that I have a precise sort of metric, but I do think, or I'm not certain that the analysis currently thinks about the issue holistically. It is energy is good, tax incentives are good, or the data is good, like having access to data is good. But I'm not confident that there's a more dynamic conversation going on about what are the other implications. And if we choose to cite a data center in locality A, what's the difference between choosing it in A versus B? If there's no requirement to do a mini NEPA analysis about alternatives. So for me, it's really being thoughtful about the process so that then informs whether or not the data center makes sense in a particular place. And if that community is willing to sacrifice the environmental harm versus their access to information. So I think that's a place-by-place decision that requires education about decision-making processes.
I'll just jump in and say I think that those are really important points, especially about disaggregating the various aspects of how you would make these decisions or how you would think about making these decisions in an ideal world. And, as far as I know, there isn't a specific framework for these specific types of citing issues. I'll just build on that answer just with a few points. And I'll answer maybe the question really directly, that I don't think the trade-off is worth it. I don't think that the information that would be generated by the AI is necessarily worth the damage currently created by the use of these data centers. And I say that based on what we're hearing directly from community members. We can look at the example in Memphis, where community voices were overridden in the process of citing these centers by the local boards. But it's not just an issue in Memphis, it's happening in Massachusetts too. It's happening in places where we think of, again, to go back to Karim's point, that we can't just think of states in a homogeneous way, but not even just blue states and red states, right? We have to really look at this at a hyper local level. And even in Massachusetts, community concerns are being overridden in the name of producing data or propping up data centers as fast as we can go. So that just really gives me pause that we're not thinking this through holistically. We don't have the right framework yet. So that's one thing. That's one thing I would say. And the other thing I would say is that's part of why I was thinking through these emergency powers, including Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. We do have components of data centers. Just to get really granular, there are components of data centers and turbines and all these, diesel engines and things like that are supposed to be regulated under the Clean Air Act. So we have tools to regulate them. The question is whether the current regulatory regime will be safe enough to protect the community surrounding it from conventional air pollutants, from the effects, which we don't know that much about yet, but the microclimate changes that are occurring from the misting from these data centers. So there's a lot that we just don't know yet. And so for that reason, I would be more cautious that there's a benefit to, an overall benefit to receiving that information when the cost on the community is so high.
So I have made a judgment about data centers, and it's twofold. There's an environmental piece to it, and there's an actual economic impact of what's happening with the race for AI. So we all use data centers even before this data center boom, right? Like if you're on the internet, if you're streaming videos, the data for that is coming through a data center. So these are not new things. They've existed, particularly in Northern Virginia, for a really long time. But it's important to remember that from a financial aspect, you've got the same 7 companies handing money back and forth to each other, creating a bubble. And only 2 or 3 of these companies are going to succeed. So when the other 4 fail, it's not going to go well for the economy as a whole. So that's how I've made my decision. They're all racing for something which is basically like sentient AI, AGI. We're not even really sure if it's possible, but we do know that whoever gets it is going to be able to define the future of the economy. That's what this is really about. It's not about being able to generate cat pictures or be able to even process data on our end any faster. They are attempting to get enough people to buy into the system of artificial intelligence so that they can justify researching self-sustained sentient AI. If that was the conversation, I think we could actually have that conversation and it would be a conversation worth having. But we are focusing on the consumer uses when that's not the real reason that all of this money is being poured into it. Secondarily, it's also important to remember that for a lot of these data centers, they're not all the hyperscale centers. Like there are hyperscalers, but we've got data centers that are popping up inside vacant office buildings. So technically they're using existing infrastructure. We've got this really interesting effect that occurs where you've got companies like Iron Mountain that build the data centers and then transfer it over. So you don't actually know who's gonna own the data center until like 6 months after it's built. And then there's also the power aspect of it, and this is the piece that pulls me in because it's an energy and climate issue. The the damage that they are doing to the energy market is wild. And the crazy part is they know that they're doing it. Microsoft has actually already proactively said, we will cover the cost of any overages to the energy market for anything that we do. And they're the ones that are being responsible. Some of the other participants in the market are pretending like they're not affecting energy supply. Electric energy is one of those things, you get it when it's generated. Like we can't store it. Well, we have some battery storage, but we can't really store it. So if everybody needs to use their computer at a set amount of time, the generating capacity has to be generating enough energy for everybody to use it. Otherwise, we're dealing with blackouts and brownouts. Data centers are pulling so much unforecasted power that providers are buying so much energy on the spot market that it's like, it's doing crazy things to the price of energy. So I think from that aspect alone, when you look at what it's done to an average person's price on their utility bill, I don't think it's worth it. I think if we were more deliberate about this and more conscientious about how we're attacking it, that would be a fair conversation. But you and I are paying for this without any awareness of why we're paying for it or frankly, any of the actual benefit.
Thank you. All right. Ooh, and then I'll come over here.
Fantastic panel. I really wanted to, really struck me, Karim, your comment about the body of proposals and solutions that was received and that the positive view on that, which I really appreciated, was like, wow, we got to save those. We have to save that information. So one, I wanted to find out whether you know how and whether it's being saved so that it can be used in the future. But the flip side of it, negative side, is the breach of faith with communities that did the work or labor to figure out what to submit, what to propose, and put it together in a form that could be received. And I've just seen in a number of different settings in work I've done with federal agencies in Region 7, we've had fora where community members are saying, a listening session or something, they're like, we've been here before. You've listened to us, you've called us here, we've shared our views. Nothing happened, now you want to hear it again. And I just wonder your thoughts on that cycle. Not that you have to have any, all the answers, I'm not expecting that, but just your thoughts on that, having worked so closely with it over time.
So there's a couple of ways to answer this question. We literally got thousands of applications and it was a rolling process. So we awarded, made public information of about 127. That information is out in the public. The federal grants process is opaque and encourages not disclosing information. So my assumption is that all of the info, because again, my job ended on January 20th when the administration's changed over. So the period of what they did with the information once it had been processed, I don't know. But what I do know is everybody who applied still has their application. So they have all the information that they generated. This goes to like the updating thing, but when it gets to the point where we actually need to pull that information back, we have all their contact information. We know who the community groups are. We can access them. We can access their applications. But as far as like a organized, I guess, arc of the information, I'm not aware of one that exists. It might, but I'm not aware of it.
Here and then.
Yeah, great panel. Sarah's talk reminded me of something my roommate once said years ago. The truth must be really bad because they're working so hard to keep it from us. But on the other side, I think and this is what I teach my students, is about how monitoring technology is getting so much better and so much cheaper. And I think as we look to the future, we need to think creatively about how we can use this as basically a way to generate demand for the product we're trying to do, which is environmental protection. And while I recognize, and I worked with Charles for years and EJ and EPA, we can get advantages even when non-EJ communities get involved. And the best example I have is ethylene oxide, where the NADA data it originally blew up because of a white middle-class community in Chicago, but they changed the MON standard to protect communities in Louisiana and other places whereby chemical plants. So I think if we look at it more broadly and creatively, we may be able to use this data to build that demand, get different kind of communities involved in essentially the fight to protect the data. Because, I mean, just the unfortunate reality is if it's a poor people's problem, it's not a very important problem. That's the way America is. But when you make it a middle-class problem, then suddenly politicians view it a little differently. And I think we need to think more broadly. And the last optimistic thing I would say is about Looper Bright. Looper Bright overruled Chevron versus NRDC, which was a case that conservatives have hated for years. Chevron won Chevron versus NRDC. And it's important to remember that the environmental statutes were written, when they're written, the Congress people get all, wax poetic about how great the environment is and environmental protection. And we can use that to go against a lot of things that have been done in the name of like, well, we'll be a little more efficient here and we'll cut a corner here. And there is really potential in Looper Bright to actually get more protection if we think about it creatively in situations.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say I agree with so much of what you said. And sounds like your roommate and I would agree too. So I think that I'll just start with something a little bit more broad and then respond specifically to what you said. So just to pull out a thread there, I think that to stay with this theme of like finding some piece of optimism, this is a moment for radically creative collaboration and trying to bridge across ideas, across organizations, across different ideologies that have not traditionally spoken with one another, that have been siloed or have experienced environmental harms differently. To your point, I do think that it's not just an environmental justice issue when we lose massive tranches of data at the federal level. Completely agree that this affects communities across the country. I have a lot of friends who are doing work looking at rural communities in particular, and the data loss is very significant there. When we have loss of federal enforcement, which is happening right now, that's a loss of information. There's a big benefit when we do environmental enforcement, that's information generating as well. And enforcement is down across the board. So that's definitely happening. And I think if you increase the demand across different populations, you'll have more voices coming to the table to create perhaps maybe this demand for private companies to come in, private tech to come in. And to your point, I mean, it's so much better now. It's the proliferation of low cost, but accurate monitoring for water, for air across different media has really increased. And to Karim's point, that's one of the reasons that they're coming for this now. So that's a really good point. And I guess I'll stop there because I want my colleagues to be able to join in. Sara. Okay.
So we've talked so much about federal law and federal grants and federal issues, but I want to bring it back down to the local level. And I think one of the most effective, makers of environmental injustice, which is local zoning law. And I know, Danielle, you just wrote about this in the renewable energy siting piece and the lack, actually, of zoning zoning laws that address access to renewable energy. I know others have worked on this as well. I'd be just interested in knowing what you think the political landscape is for working at the local level on land use issues that speak very powerfully to environmental justice concerns and that you haven't addressed yet. So that's just a very open-ended question.
It's funny because I think that is also a segue into the project that I referenced that Uma and I are working on. So I think that there's a large appetite both at the local and state level. We've talked about the lack of sort of homogeneous, the limited homogeneity within these different scales of governance. So I would say there are so many alliances, even at the local level, that are pushing towards sustainability planning, climate planning, that also incorporates model zoning sort of regulations to think about the issues holistically. So I am, of the mind, yes, we've talked a lot about the federal government, but to me, it's always an all of government, whichever sort of position has the authority or the will or the capital to move those issues forward. And so interestingly, in the 4 states that we're looking at in this sort of energy and environmental justice project, some states have been removing siting authority. So the locality has the ability to regulate and to sort of be involved in the decision-making authority for energy siting. But the state, so for example, in New York, that's the longest standing example right now, has taken some of that authority because the state has a larger commitment to the climate goals than rather than upstate New York, which may be anti some renewable energy siting. So there are lots of tools that are currently being employed. And so I do think there's an opportunity to do more work between the sort of nuance between community say and community preference, both within the data center sort of aspect, but also in the renewable energy component, and how do we incorporate community voice, community expertise, and community desires, while also thinking about the larger sort of common good of a shared environment. And I think those are hard issues, but there's certainly an appetite that we've seen in localities across states. It doesn't matter red or blue. And so I do think it's an exciting moment for people to go to their local sort of planning meetings, to be involved in like climate action planning when they do the public call. And that's an area where we can use our expertise to sort of at least hold local government accountable for the things that we'd like to see.
I'll just add quickly, Sara, you know this, of course, but one of the things that we're actively thinking about right now is DC is rewriting its comprehensive plan right now, and which is, oh, okay, sorry.
No, it's cool. It's cool.
So I think this is a really ripe moment to think about how we can incorporate issues like cumulative burdens and cumulative impacts assessment into that process.
No. I was just gonna say the last time DC did its comp plan, I was actually at the department that was one of the leads. But it's time. And like the good thing about DC, particularly if you're interested in pushing these issues, they have very ambitious goals, and they're just a net. We don't produce energy here aside from rooftop solar. So you have the ability to make really aggressive demands about what the city sets for its sustainability goals, about our resilience goals too. Being able to, like if you go north on, I think it's 15th Street, you'll actually see that there's this seawall that they very carefully put into around the Capitol. But there's a part where it's clear that it's an elevatable seawall once you get past the Washington Monument. Like they can like drop in walls to deal with flooding. And that was because DC decided the comprehensive plan in DC has 2 components. One is federal, one is state. They have to collaborate on them. In a lot of ways, the federal government has the ability to overturn the parts of the DC comprehensive plan if they don't like it or if they think it's inconsistent with the federal plan. When we redid the flood maps in DC back in like 17 or 18, the federal government didn't like it, but they didn't stop us. But it required them to do certain construction in the city in order to deal with the increased likelihood of flood, or especially around the monuments. So you see little physical reminders of the fact that like DC is actually recognizing that this is real, we're gonna have consequences for this, and we're trying to deal with the infrastructure pieces around it. If you look at the break in the Northwest Connector, like that's actually an indicator of the fact that when they built this, they were thinking about what would happen. The inlet for our water supply is deliberately north of that pipe. If it was reversed, we'd all have a really big problem because we only have one source of water. So being involved in things like the comprehensive plan, which you can do as residents.
Yep.
You don't have to be on a committee. You can just show up and say what you think. So please do that.
Yep.
But yeah, it's a really good opportunity. And if you live in the adjoining suburbs, It may not be as aggressive, but like if you live in Prince George's County, we buy a lot of our power from Prince George's County. So how the power plants are like sited, whether or not they're coal versus natural gas, these are things that are important to the entire region. So back to my earlier point, I think it's really important to think about this locally and regionally and try to exert influence on our neighbors as well.
This is more of an observation. I'm not sure if there's any other municipal lawyers in the room, but just thinking again, comprehensive planning, climate action planning, creating the vision, creating the framework, but just remembering, again, based on Sarah's work, that the plan is the plan, and taking folks to enforce the plan. You can do that in some states like California, New York, Oregon, but you got to have it in the code. So establishing those goals and frameworks is the first thing, getting in the code, and then you got to have capacity. Who's going to administer the code? At the local level, at least there's apparatus to do that, but the capacity of many local governments, even once you write the code to then implement, is a whole other issue a little further downstream.
Yeah, great point.
Just agreed, and anecdotally, I would say in Virginia, we have an environmental justice law that basically is a guidance statement. And so depending on the administration that's in place, it's up to those agencies to then develop policies to enforce the guidance statement that's in the statute. And so, don't have a silver bullet there either, but just recognizing that depending on a moment in time, there are different tools that the various sort of localities in that instance could use because they have at least the ability to do so because of the statute. And, I think even building sort of metropolitan collaboratives. So when there's a strong urban center that maybe has more expertise, allowing that to sort of also be utilized in a way that supports surrounding localities. I've seen that used a lot. And so this notion of collaboration, even across localities, I think is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa. And this may be the last word.
Yes. So I am listening with such interest and admiration, and I'm also feeling like a sense of unreality because we're in a moment, we're talking about race and place and justice, and my God, we're in a moment of erasing racial history. We're in a moment of basically making protection against racism itself unconstitutional. We're in a moment where we're going into neighborhoods and detaining people, arresting them indefinitely, based on the idea that the very presence of people in a neighborhood is illegal, right? And so I'm just wondering, how do we think about that in light of, because it's all feeling very much the same to me, and not in a good way. And so I'm just wondering how you deal with that.
Can I? Who's seen Nuremberg? Like, this is like the 5th movie about Nuremberg, but this one's particularly good. I would say 2 things. It's important to remember that the story of America is a story of high expectations and low achievement, and like closing that gap. The central promise of our country is we want to be here, we are here, how do we get here? So when you think about the overarching history of America, this is not the first time we have had an abusive government treating a portion of the population as a disposable labor pool and an unwanted labor pool. The hope is always that this is the last time, but this is not the first time. So we have, in these prior instances, clear examples of what persistence can do when we fight against it. The trick is always to not get overwhelmed by the random reckless cruelty, the things that are done just for the sake of shaking people. And as long as you remember that they always lose, oppression cannot naturally stand. It is brittle, it will fall apart, it has to be constantly maintained. All you have to do is resist. and eventually it will fall apart. And I say that not to be like Pollyanna-ish, but I think it's a reality. Eventually they fall apart. You think about the structure of the first administration of this guy, and eventually what you saw was that people had lines. They were like, I'm not willing to do that. I still believe in the rule of law. I'm not willing to ignore this. I swore an oath. And they're a little bit better at getting people that are willing to compromise themselves, but eventually they will start to realize at some point he won't be there, and they're going to be held accountable for the decisions that they make. And that's when they start to break. Just like in 45, when you had a whole bunch of Nazis fleeing Germany, they realized that the gig was up, and they were like, I don't want to have to deal with the consequences of having gone along with this. You're going to see the same thing. I don't know when it's going to happen, but eventually the self-preservation will override their ability to be sycophants, and they'll be worried about consequences, and that's when it starts to collapse. We just have to persevere and not give up or be demoralized, but eventually this will collapse.
Well, that was so well said. I can't add to that. So.
I would just say resilience comes to mind, not just in the climate context. Like resilience is a way of life. It's a way of system functioning. So not just an environmental system, but like a human system. And to me, I can't allow myself to sort of think in those terms, but I think that's because my outward manifestation is one of the demographics that has been challenged over time. So I'm not, I don't get excited about that because I come from a history of people who've had to withstand that. And so I think learning about resilience and integrating that just as systemic thinking broadly is how I navigate the topic, being immersed in the topic, and to get up and try to be excited and to motivate students to be in the topic. I think it's how do you cultivate resilience? And so that's what I think about.
I guess I'll just add one thing, which is, I mean, yes, to resilience and to the point that Karim made. I think it's also a really important moment, though, to Lisa, to your point about remaining clear-eyed about what's going on, which is why, in part that I started framing my remarks that I legitimately think we are in a crisis of information right now. We're in multiple crises that I think are intersecting, they're compounding, but I'm just going to take a small one, which was information. I think it's not overblowing it to call it a crisis, because I agree with you. I think that's where we are. I think one way to be in this crisis, but like not lose touch with our humanity, is to hold space for bearing witness to the people who are at the center of the storm. And for me, that's my work with my clients, and just being able to sit and bear witness to what they're experiencing, even if I just am grabbing for any tool I can to make change. And even as I mentioned before, that toolkit feels like it's shrinking every day, but I still feel it's my responsibility to be there and be with them and hold space for them to express what's going on. And it is transformative for our students to be able to do that with me. I learned so much from them. They learned so much from the experience. And in that way, I hope that we won't have 4 years of students who are not hearing, just to go back to your earlier point, who aren't hearing about environmental justice, who aren't hearing about these issues. It's, to think through our responsibility as educators, not just scholars, engaging in those conversations, showing the reality of what's happening is really important too.
I can't think of a better set of responses to end on, and I want to invite everybody to join me in thanking you all so much for the